Man's natural estate. Many diseases reversed by sunlight and open air. This is Eden 7 of God's magnificent outdoor automatic healthcare system series. Hello, I am John EverBlest. Seventh-day Adventists were called by God to organize and lead the great health reform movement. They were the flagship, so to speak. But they were not the only ones who were called to that great hygienic health reform movement. God had other reformers in other ships. The hygienic physicians and health reformers of that era came from widely different beliefs and backgrounds. Yet they all came to the same conclusion, that sunlight and open air is man's natural estate. Their conclusions testified to the truth of the Bible when it proclaimed that God saw the light and that it was good. They found that sunlight and fresh air both wonderfully prevented and reversed disease, and that nothing else could replace them. So, we start with some broad statements from just a few of those hygienic pioneers. There were many. First pioneer up is Ellen White. She says, "The feeble one should press out into sunshine as earnestly and naturally as do the shaded plants and vines. The pale and sickly grain blade that has struggled up out of the cold of early spring puts out the natural and healthy deep green after enjoying, for a few days, the health and life-giving rays of the sun. Go out into the light and warmth of the glorious sun, you pale and sickly ones, and share with vegetation its life-giving, health-dealing power." Dr. Herbert M. Shelton. "Whoever lives habitually in the sun grows strong." Ellen White again. "Invalids too often deprive themselves of sunlight. This is one of nature's most healing agents." Dr. Augusta Rollier. He says, "The direct action of sun rays on the whole of the patient's naked body, combined with the beneficent effects of the pure and bracing mountain air, constitutes the best of tonics and health restores." That's saying something. And by the way, in 1903, Dr. Rollier opened his sun care clinic and became world-renowned. He was the tip of the spear in hygienic health reform as it related to sunlight. He was the leader in sunlight. Not Kellogg, not the Battle Creek Sanitarium, not Adventists. Even Dr. Kellogg made 2 round-trip ocean voyages to Dr. Augusta Rollier's clinics to learn his methods and principles. Dr. Arnold Rickley. "Water is good, air is better, but sunlight is best of all." Now, that quote was taken from the wall of a museum in Slovenia dedicated to Dr. Rickley and his natural health work. Dr. Kellogg from the Battle Creek Sanitarium News, September 1, 1933. "In 2 large outdoor gymnasiums, one for men and one for women, patients get close to nature, sunbathe, exercise, play, and swim encumbered with much less clothing than the most abbreviated swimming suit. This has long been one of the most effective treatments given." George Wharton James. "If sick people knew enough, were wise enough to go out into the open and discard all civilized modes of life, climbing mountains, sleeping on pine boughs, swimming in the streams, working in the soil, dabbling in the hot or cold springs, eating the ripe fruits and nuts, and bathing the whole body daily in bright sunshine, well, they would be brought to a health and vigor they had never before known. That's taken from an interesting book with the title, What the White Race May Learn from the Indian, 1908. Well, now those were the assertions. Now let's see the proof. Just so you know, there were many healing stories that can be told here of different diseases reversed by sunlight and fresh air. I collect all those stories. My library is filled with them. This presentation represents just a tiny little fraction of what sunlight can do in actual people, not lab tests, not theories, actual experiences. We start with the health of Native American Indians living in the sunlight. H.B. Cushman, who was born among the Indians of missionary parents while they were still east of the Mississippi, and who went west with them when they were ruthlessly driven from their homelands, spending nearly 70 years among them, says in his history of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez Indians, 1889, that among the Choctaws, deformity was almost unknown, proving that nature in the wild forest of the wilderness is true to her type. Again, it is said of the Natchez that the sight was never shocked by the appearance of deformity, such as are so frequently observed among the white race. And with equal truth, the same may be said of all North American Indians. George Catlin tells us that amongst 2 million of these people, these Indians, that he met with, very few cases of deformity. It is important in this connection that we take account of the fact that there was no tuberculosis, no anemia, no leukemia, no rickets, no hunchbacks, no bow-leggeds, no idiots or lunatics, no defective teeth, no deaf and dumb, and almost no deaths either of mother or child in childbirth, and few skin diseases among the Indians before the white men civilized them. That is, in other words, clothed them, gave them fire water to drink, cooped them up on reservations, and taught them to eat white bread, salt bacon, black coffee, and sorghum molasses. That was from Herbert Shelton. Now, the health of those living in the shade. Let's talk about that. In the deep valleys among the Alps of Switzerland, the sun shines only a few hours each day. In consequence, the inhabitants suffer terribly from scrofula and other diseases indicative of poor nutrition. Wait a minute, poor nutrition? Diseases indicative of poor nutrition, but they were not malnourished as far as food goes, but lack of sunlight prevented that assimilation of certain nutrients and minerals. And we will demonstrate the truth of my assertion as we proceed. Let's continue with this statement here, back up a bit. In consequence, the inhabitants suffered terribly from scrofula and other diseases indicative of poor nutrition. The women, almost without exception, are deformed by huge goiters, which hang pendant from their necks, unless suspended by a sling. A considerable portion of the males are idiots. Higher up on the sides of the mountains, the same mountains, the inhabitants are remarkably hardy and are well developed, physically and mentally. The only difference in their modes of life is the greater amount of sunshine higher up the mountainside. When the poor unfortunates below are carried up the mountain, they rapidly improve. That's from Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, The Monitor of Health, 1891, page 62. Another example of living in the shade, cholera and yellow fever. I was practicing my profession in Buffalo, New York, during the 49 and 51, those memorial cholera seasons. I saw at least 5 cases of cholera on the shady side of the street and houses to 1 on the sunny side. One eminent physician in New Orleans reports from his practice 8 cases of yellow fever on the shady side of the street to 1 on the sunny side of the street. And who has not read Florence Nightingale's observations in Crimea, showing the difference between the shady and the sunny sides of the hospitals? In St. Petersburg, the shady side of the hospitals was so notoriously unfavorable to the sick soldier that the Tsar himself decreed them into disuse. That was from D.O. Lewis, Health and How to Live. Athletic and mental vigor. It is said of the Romans and the Greeks that their athletes were purposely exposed to the sun until they soon became deeply pigmented for the purpose of developing winning competitors through the increased vigor which they sustained in the consequence of that exposure. A famous athletic coach and trainer in a Middle Western university has recently revived this ancient custom with his own teams. During the winter months, each member of that athletic squad receives daily an exposure to the mercury arc. In other words, an antique tanning device. He continues, various muscular tests have been conducted on exposed and unexposed athletes. And from these tests, it has been concluded that the athletes pigmented under the ultraviolet radiation show more energy and persistence, which is estimated to be approximately 20% greater than the unirradiated competitors. Man, if you have a kid in school and he's into athletics, get him into the sunlight. Continuing on, coincident with this increase in muscular vigor and endurance, mental alertness has also been noted as measured by the scholastic attainment of those athletes who had previously shown some difficulty with their studies. Isn't that interesting? Light and health. The Hindus, several thousand years ago, attributed a rejuvenating effect to the sun's rays. They stated that the latter restored vigor to the muscles of the aged. Well, that gives us some hope here. And enlivened their minds. Such a belief in the healing and conserving qualities of sunlight can be traced in the historical writings of many of the nations of ancient times, not alone in Europe, Asia, and Africa, but likewise in America. And he mentioned Mexico too. I just didn't have the room. Dr. James C. Jackson noted nearly 80 years ago that the more a man lives in sunlight, other things being equal, the more vigorous will his brain be. Now, this is an algorithm for our health. Sunburn. Treating sunburn with sunlight. This is from Dr. Auguste Aurelier, Heliotherapy, 1927, page 269 to 270. He says, it might appear paradoxical to suggest that sunlight therapy as a remedy for solar erythema, which means sunburn, at the beginning of our career when our technique had not yet been fully developed, we often came across cases of solar erythema, and we tried for it all the commonly employed measures such as compresses, glycerin, Vaseline, lotions, etc., besides also making a pause in the irradiation. In other words, a pause in the sunbathing. Some patients, however, who were in a hurry to get thoroughly pigmented, discarded all those modern applications and continued taking sunbaths as if nothing happened, as if they didn't have a sunburn. After 2 to 3 more exposures, the erythema disappeared, having passed into a bronzed discoloration of the skin. The latter now no longer sensitive to the scorching effects of the sun. Hey, that's interesting. In cases treated by the usual methods, erythema lasted much longer, sometimes a week even, and was followed by desquamation, or peeling skin. So what he's saying here, instead of red and peeling, red to bronzing with no peeling. Now, when I posted this on my Facebook page this last week, one of my readers, Sue Andrick, responded by saying, "Very interesting. I have actually experienced this recently while holidaying in Greece." So, verification. Posture and sunlight? Oh, come on. Well, let's see. I was contacted by a lady, the wife of Larry Peterson. She's standing right behind him there. She told me that in September of 2024, Larry Peterson of Florida was taken on a 21-day family tour of the U.S. national parks. He had Parkinson's-induced forward neck drop. His son did much of the driving of the motorhome at night, so that Larry, from early morning till after sunset, could be in the fresh air, sunlight, and the healing beauty of nature, literally healing beauty. His neck dramatically straightened in just 21 days, even though he was fully clothed, in a wheelchair, and could not exercise. All he had to do was show up. It was automatic. What I've been telling you about automatic. All right, next. Sunlight acts as a corset. This is from Heliotherapy, page 279, by Dr. Augusta A. Rollier, 1927. He says, "The sun encourages development of muscles of the neck, shoulder, and back in general. This strengthening of muscles and ligaments supporting the spinal column is equivalent to a muscular corset holding up the thorax." Now, who else would know that except Dr. Augusta Rollier? He was the expert from experience. Cysts. This is my own story coming up. Ganglion cysts. My wife Susan and I flew from Nebraska to San Diego, California for my brother's funeral. We were there for the first 5 days of January 2025. While we were there, we walked barefoot on the beaches and breathed the fresh, negatively charged ocean breezes as much as we could, and the minerals in the air as well from the spray. When we got back home, we discovered that we had each unknowingly left something behind. I had a ganglion cyst on my right wrist for months. It was no longer there. Susan had a ganglion cyst on her wrist for years. It was no longer there either. Think about that for a moment. The merciful love of God to make this automatically when we are outdoors. Reminds me of my favorite texts. I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn thee. Jeremiah 31:3. You'll see this pattern. This is happening automatically for people who have no idea that it's actually happening. Respiratory. Now, Ellen White made an interesting statement. She said, there are life-giving properties in the balsam of the pine, in the fragrance of the cedar and the fir. And there are other trees that are health-promoting as well. She also mentioned hemlock at another place. Let no such trees be ruthlessly cut down. Cherish them, where they are abundant, and plant more where there are but few, because they are healing. In another presentation, I show the science where it actually heals tumors, cancer tumors. But that's another presentation. Now, continuing on, this is from Atmospheric Air in Relationship to Tuberculosis by Guy Hinsdale, 1914, page 3 and 5. He says, the physicians of ancient Rome sent consumptive patients to the pine forests of Libya. He has come to an axiom in physiology. By the way, physiology is the study of tuberculosis. Let's read it again. It has come to be an axiom that the study of tuberculosis, that the aid of an evergreen forest is eminently suitable for a patient with tuberculosis. As we have previously mentioned, the pine forests of Libya were used 2,000 years ago for the cure of ulcerated lungs. At that period, the pines abounded and gave the locality a reputation as a health resort for affections of lungs. Aside from the generally beneficial influence of forests, universally recognized by climatologists, these natural parks have proved the means of restoring thousands of persons suffering from tuberculosis and diseases of the respiratory system. We are told that if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Exodus 15:26. So, whether you realize it or not, intentional or unintentional, if you are in nature, you are already obeying a large percentage of his statutes, because his health statutes are mostly embedded into nature. Therefore, health building is automatic when you find yourself in nature. It's God's chosen health care for us. And if we knowingly or unknowingly neglect nature, we suffer the consequences. Skin. The skin that has become weakened by clothing serves as a less effective barrier to infectious matter from the outside. Medical books list about 20 different forms of skin inflammation, about 40 different varieties of hypertrophies, 35 atrophies, several forms of neurosis, several varieties of skin hemorrhages, about 60 to 70 kinds of new growths, and many parasitical affections. These skin diseases appear almost wholly among the much-clad denizens of the hothouse condition we proudly term civilization, and are seldom, some of them never, met with among the unclad races. In other words, the undressed. Stroke. Partial paralysis or stroke. One of the ablest lawyers in our country, a victim of long and hard brain labor, came to me a year ago suffering with partial paralysis. The right leg and hip were reduced in size, with constant pain in the loins. He was obliged, in coming upstairs, to raise the left foot first on every stair, dragging the right one after it. Pale, feeble, miserable, he told me he had been failing several years, and closed with, "My work is done. At 60, I find myself worn out." So I directed him to lie down under the large window a large window, and allow the sun to fall upon every part of his body. Every part of his body. At first, 10 minutes a day, increasing the time until he could expose himself to the direct rays of the sun a full hour. His habits were not essentially altered in any other particular. But in 6 months, he came running upstairs like a vigorous man of 40 and declared with sparkling eyes, "I have 20 years more of work in me." That was from D.O. Lewis, Health or How to Live, number 6, 1865, from the Adventist Pioneer Library. Overeating. Really, what does overeating have to do with the sun cure? Overeating shuts off the sun cure. There is a close relationship between the function of the skin as an organ of absorption and the amount of food received by way of the alimentary canal. As the former increased, so does the latter diminish. In the practice of heliotherapy, therefore, rules of diet must be laid down. The patient must be persuaded to reduce the amount of food taken. This is Augusta Roulier from his book Heliotherapy, 1927, page 155. In other words, Dr. Roulier is saying that overeating diminishes the ability of the skin to absorb the healing rays of sunlight and fresh air and all that entails. It certainly messes with our ability to assimilate things like calcium, because sunlight assures the proper levels and balance of calcium in our bodies. Sunlight is a catalyst that enables calcium assimilation. And we go through more of that as we go on. That theme's going to come back up. Digestion. This fellow here had dyspepsia, or chronic indigestion. Many years ago, a clergyman who had for years been a victim of dyspepsia and who had prayed for death as the only door of escape, came through the advice of a mutual friend to consult me. I advised the disuse of all medicines, the generous use of cracked wheat, good beef, and much exposure to the sunshine. To secure the last mentioned influence, I directed him to enclose 20 feet square in his garden with a close fence and plant the ground within with something, the cultivation of which would occupy his mind. Then, when the weather was warm, shutting himself in, he was to busy himself, quite nude, with the cultivation of his vegetables from 10 to 60 minutes a day, always indulging in a thorough bath and friction before leaving. He was radically cured. Teeth. Dental cavities. Primary grade pupils were divided into 2 lots. All represented various ages and both sexes, whose housing conditions were poor, and who, as ascertained through social service investigation, had a home environment in which improper selection of food and defective attention to hygiene were incident to the low social standing of the parents. All showed obvious imperfection, particularly caries, indentation in the teeth. These young students were divided into 2 groups, balanced as to age, sex, and dental conditions. The first group served as a normal control group. The second group served as an experimental group. The experimental group was exposed daily to ultraviolet radiation of those wavelengths, which are believed to be most beneficial. This was artificial sunlight, tanning lamps. The treatments of the experimental group lasted throughout the school term. They were given every second day. We'll get back to this. School holidays excluded, and continued until the beginning of the summer vacation. No instructions were issued to either group as to special diets or change in home life. When school convened in the fall, the dentist in charge of oral hygiene again observed and recorded the conditions of the teeth in all the children in both groups. All right, that's the end of that one. I need to explain why there's question marks there. The author, M. Lukács, was retelling the experience of his co-author, A.J. Piccini. Lukács first states that the UV exposure was daily. 2 sentences later, he states that the UV exposure was every second day. We don't know which one was correct. Neither one of them caught it. But other schools in that period used them daily. Like, for instance, the open-air school in Battle Creek, they said that they used it daily. And that was run by, assisted with Dr. Kellogg's help. All right, continuing on that. Progressive defectiveness and increasing caries in the normal, untreated group was strikingly evident, as distinguished from the correction of dental abnormalcies and the practically complete check of carious disintegration in those who had been exposed to ultraviolet radiation. Since the experiment involved some 300 school children and the result was so striking, it impelled the conclusion that the ultraviolet radiation used for its biological effect can be made efficient in assuring the marked correction of faulty calcium assimilation, which is responsible for many of the early defects and pathologies of the teeth. Sunlight made these remarkable improvements in the teeth, even though the participants had lifestyle of improper selection of food and poor hygiene. Mostly it seems to be because of the calcium assimilation which sunlight made possible. Different study. Good white teeth generally accompany a normal thyroid secretion. Oh, well, that means that dimmed teeth may tend to indicate a low-functioning thyroid. Well, then let's talk about the hypothyroid glands. Hypothyroid. But what an opposite picture a thyroid-deficient patient presents. The skin becomes coarse and rough. The hair straightens. Physical and mental growth is thwarted. An excess of heavy sleep seems always to be required. Laziness is the rule. Colds, tonsillitis, and almost every disease of childhood which happens along is sure to be visited on the individual. Let's talk about laziness here. Laziness may not just be a selfish avoidance of work. What if it's a hypothyroid condition? What if we send them out into the sunlight on a regular basis? If your child is lazy, maybe he's just unhealthy. Now, in such cases, ultraviolet radiation often produces a marked transformation. Dullness is replaced by brightness. The phantom complexion, that's pale complexion, becomes ruddy and glowing. Growth is regained. Laziness is dispelled, and the balance of the internal secretion show that the thyroid has been stimulated to a greater output. Very good. Blood. Leukemia and anemia, these are both blood diseases. Leukemia is a blood cancer. This is from the Hygienic System, Volume 3, by Dr. Herbert Shelton. He says Dr. Troll declared that nearly all forms of disease are more severe and unmanageable in low, dark apartments. With an insufficiency of light, the blood fibrin and the red corpuscles become diminished in quantity. The serum or water portion of the blood is increased, inducing leukemia. They knew what this was back then. A condition characterized by a great increase in the number of white blood corpuscles. A total exclusion of sunlight induces the more severe forms of anemia as well. A fact emphasized by Troll, originating from the impoverished and disordered state of the blood. Hemophilia. A few minutes of exposure daily to the sunlight will double the quantity of phosphorus in a baby's blood in a fortnight? Really? In 2 weeks? That's 2 weeks. The circulation of the blood itself is improved while blood pressure is lessened. The power of the blood to build and repair tissues is increased and its coagulating power greatly improved. It sounds like in 2 weeks. All right, that was from the hygienic system again, Dr. Herbert M. Shelton. Metabolism. Slow metabolism. Air baths. Air playing over the body may increase metabolism 50% in 10 minutes. 10 minutes! Thyroid extract, medicine's only claimed stimulant of metabolism, is said to require a year to accomplish the same thing. 10 minutes, taking an air bath. Dr. Leonard Hill showed that a high cooling power, wind, not only increases the heat production of the body during exposure, but raises the basal metabolism to a higher level. He points out that the fire of life is made to burn faster. When we completely clothe ourselves all the time, we slow down our metabolism. By the way, the same thing works for sunlight. Just didn't have the time to put this in here. By the way, Benjamin Franklin also had daily air baths, totally naked, in private. All right. Reproduction. Now, this reproduction, this is the largest section, and this is where I end it on this reproduction, because it applies to everybody, mother, child, father, whether you're pregnant or not. There's a principle here about calcium uptake, assimilation, and sunlight. And it goes through this, all through this. Here we go. Reproduction. Childbirth pain for nudists. Women who sunbathe nude have more flexible skin and needn't be cut in order to prevent tearing during childbirth. Dr. Robert Bradley states, I have had the privilege of acting as obstetrician for professional nudists. And from the physical standpoint, I could not argue with those sun-tanned all-over mothers. Their skin is more flexible, less brittle. That's Dr. Robert Bradley, Husband Coached Childbirth, 1978. You can also see that in the book Sunlight, page 89. All right. Back to another observation from childbirth pain. This is from Dr. Herbert M. Shelton from the book The Hygienic System. He says, the subjection of a pregnant woman to daily sunbaths will benefit both her and the developing fetus. And I am convinced will also do much towards lessening the pains that now make childbirth a harrowing ordeal in so many cases. Sufficient sunshine during pregnancy will not only produce better general health in the mother and better development in the child, but it will prevent the loss of so much blood by the mother from having C-section or being cut. Girls brought up in the sunshine, properly fed, and normally active should develop so well that normally painless childbirth should be the rule instead of the now rare exception. Doesn't that sound like God's fingerprints, doesn't it? Sounds like what he would do. He continues, "It is worthy of note that those mothers who are in the sunlight the least are the ones who have the most difficult deliveries in childbirth. The unclad races have the easiest deliveries." So, application, expectant mothers, you spend those 9 months of pregnancy in sunlight and fresh air and exercise outdoors. Now here comes a really serious one. Eclampsia. Eclampsia, cavities, osteoporosis, and tetany in pregnancy. We're especially going to talk about eclampsia because it's the worst. Here's what this doc says. He says, unless the calcium requirements of the embryo are exactly met by the ability of the mother to satisfy them, either the embryo or the mother, or both, may suffer a serious derangement in the calcium metabolism. Therefore, at this critical period, the mechanism of calcium metabolism must operate with great nicety if ill health is to be avoided, and it is becoming more and more realized that light, and especially ultraviolet light, play important parts in striking a physiologic balance between the calcium needs of the mother and the calcium needs of the child. He continues, not infrequently, the calcium surplus of the mother is drained. It has been shown that the calcium content of the blood tends to fall in the latter half of pregnancy, and it is at this time that the various symptoms and signs attributable to such a deficiency appear. Carious teeth and fragile, overporous, and easily fractured bones are observed. Even a form of tetany sometimes develops, which seems to be associated with a derangement in the secretion of the parathyroid glands, whose function it is in part to preside over the calcium regulation of the body. The periods of high calcium demanded by the fetus coincide with the times at which the onset of eclampsia is most common. The dreaded convulsive attacks of eclampsia can be prevented and checked by ensuring a high calcium storage in the blood, such as exposure to ultraviolet radiation. Certainly, civilization has imposed a tremendous penalty upon the modern mother in childbirth. Hardships which earlier and more natural mothers are known to have escaped entirely. And although there are many artificialities which go to make up this hardship, the retreat from sunlight seems to be one for whose abnegation maternity is now paying a considerable toll. It is the ultraviolet fraction of sunlight which has most to do with maintaining a proper calcium balance in the organism. And by this radiation, many mothers have been spared preventable suffering and ill health, and have given birth to wholesome and vigorous babies who might otherwise have been handicapped from the very beginning of their life. Science is trying to make amends for some of the tendencies of civilization, and not the least of these is the ability to revert to artificial sunshine at the critical time of life when the good health of two beings, mother and child, is seriously at stake. Even before the baby is born, its skeletal development is influenced by the sunshine, which does or does not reach the mother. Following its birth, the child is many times more dependent upon sunshine. But as long as it suckles, it obtains indirectly some of the benefit which the mother obtains from solar radiation. That was from M. Lukish and A.J. Piccini in the book Light and Health. Next, mother's milk and pregnancy. Sunbaths, both before and after childbirth, increase the mother's ability to nurse her baby and to improve the quality of the milk, while they tend to prevent tiredness, backache, nausea, is that morning sickness? Loss of appetite, emotionalism, and hysteria during pregnancy. Sunshine is even essential to the production of good milk. Hess showed that milk from cows fed on pastures in the sunlight maintains the health and growth of young animals, whereas milk from cows maintained out of the sun and fed on fodder will not maintain life and growth. He continues, it is notorious that the clad races, and especially those who live in the cities and are in the sun but little, are unable to supply their children with milk that will sustain them. Babies that are themselves light-starved and that are fed on milk from light-starved mothers or light-starved cows are at a double disadvantage. Milk from pasture-fed cows is not only richer in vitamins, but contains much higher percentages of phosphorus and calcium, there it is, and get this, 50% more citric acid. Who knew? They knew way back then. Cows and mothers can produce perfect milk only when given green foods and exposed to the sun. We never put that together before. Young animals fed exclusively on milk from cows fed in the shade on dry fodder lose weight and die. Similar animals fed on similar quantities of milk from cows that run in the pasture, getting both sunlight and green foods, grow and thrive. God is very good to have brought this back up to us. Dr. Taylor declared, this is continuing, Dr. Taylor declared, nursing mothers especially need these hygienic influences, sunlight, to maintain the purity and vigor of their system, that they may not lay the foundation for lasting disease in their offspring. For the child is sure to suffer, even sooner than the mother, the grievous consequences of her physiological errors. So again, expectant mothers, don't dare show up for delivery without a deep tan. In closing, sun exposure is winter prep. The man who has received no sunshine, who has stayed indoors or has clothed his body in a way to exclude the sun, that includes sunscreen, by the way, and the man who has dissipated his reserves cannot go through the winter without suffering. The best preparation with which to meet the long, cold, cloudy winters is a sensible, natural mode of living during the warm, sunny months. A paradigm shift is needed. we can no longer relegate to an inferior position an element of hygiene which is so important and so necessary an influence on health and growth. Due to the fact that sunshine is an essential of healthy nutrition, being necessary to growth, development, and repair of tissues, it is of value in all states or conditions of the body. It is not a specific cure for one or two so-called specific diseases, as the medical profession teaches. It is a hygienic, not a therapeutic agent, and is needed as well in health as in conditions of impaired health. There are but few who realize that in order to enjoy health and cheerfulness, they must have an abundance of sunlight, pure air, and physical exercise. That was from Ellen White. If sunlight is so necessary to the perpetuation of life and the production of normal development, then it is equally necessary to the preservation of health and the prevention of disease. Therefore, the body must inevitably be weakened and diseased in its absence. That applies to everybody. It fills an important need in the organism, and its place cannot be filled with anything else. The highest degree of health cannot be attained and maintained without it. It is essential to the restoration of health and hastens recovery in all forms of illness. Therefore, I agree with Salibi, who declares every sanitarium which is not essentially a solarium must today be called a tragic farce. And that was well over 75 years ago. That was from Dr. Herbert Shelton. God hath called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Go out into the light and warmth of the glorious sun, you pale and sickly ones, and share with vegetation its life-giving, health-dealing power. God is magnificent, isn't he? God is so good. Truly, his health care is embedded into nature, God's magnificent, outdoor, automatic health care system. And we thank you so much for watching this video.